A reporter asked Mark Carney on Saturday morning why it suddenly felt like Canada was going to war. He did not soften the question. He did not deflect it. He looked straight into the cameras and said, "You're at war. When you get attacked, we got attacked." Those 7 words, spoken by a former central banker who has spent his entire career choosing language with surgical precision, just confirmed what markets, manufacturers, and millions of workers on both sides of the border had spent the entire week bracing for. The talks failed. The 50% tariffs are already live, and Canada has now locked in a retaliation date, dollar for dollar, hitting American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, paper, and electronics starting September 8th. A date that, within hours of being announced, had already become the single most closely watched line on the North American economic calendar. If you want to understand exactly how 3 days of what both sides were calling intensive, constructive negotiations collapsed into the most serious rupture in Canada-U.S. trade relations in modern memory, and what specifically got said behind closed doors that blew the whole thing up, stay with this video until the end, because the details here go far beyond a simple tariff dispute. Hit subscribe now if you want to keep following this story, because both governments are now openly describing this relationship using language that neither side has used before, and what happens over the next 2 weeks will shape how this fight escalates from here. Let's go back to where this particular chapter actually started, because Saturday's collapse did not come out of nowhere. On August 18th, less than 2 hours before a 50% tariff was set to hit $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, Trump posted on social media that he had paused the tariffs for 3 days, citing what he called a deal between the two countries, subject to the finalization of documents. Carney's own statement that night was noticeably more cautious, saying only that substantial progress had been made and that important work remained. That gap between the two accounts turned out to be the entire story in miniature. Over the following 3 days, negotiators worked almost around the clock in Washington. Sources briefed on the talks described the outline of a real agreement taking shape, one that would have lowered U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 50% down to 25%, cut the headline tariff on Canadian-built cars from 25% to 15%, and reduced duties on lumber as well. Canada, for its part, had reportedly offered to drop its remaining retaliatory tariffs from the earlier rounds of this fight and to encourage provinces to put American liquor back on store shelves after more than a year of provincial bans. By Wednesday of that week, Carney had briefed the premiers on the outlines of a deal that appeared to be coming together, one that officials were quietly pitching as the best available option, even though it would not eliminate Trump's tariffs entirely. For a moment, it looked like the countdown was finally going to end with a signed framework rather than another round of duties. Then, in the final hours on Friday night, the entire thing came apart. And based on what Carney laid out in detail at Saturday's press conference, it did not fall apart over some minor technicality. It fell apart over 3 specific issues, each one revealing something important about how far this negotiation had actually drifted from a normal trade dispute. If you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and drop a like right now, because understanding exactly what those 3 issues were is the key to understanding why this rupture feels so different from every previous deadline in this fight. The first, and by far the most consequential, was trucks. The American offer on the table would have lowered tariffs specifically on cars and SUVs built in Canada, but it excluded medium and heavy-duty vehicles entirely, something Carney said represented a big last-minute change from what negotiators believed they had already agreed to. That distinction sounds technical, but it is not. It directly threatens some of the largest vehicle platforms still manufactured on Canadian soil, including Ford's F-350, F-450, and F-550 pickups in General Motors' Silverado line, all built at plants that support tens of thousands of direct and spin-off jobs concentrated heavily in Ontario. The federal government had already committed more than $460 million to help retrofit Ford's Oakville plant, specifically to build heavy-duty trucks, an investment that would become considerably harder to justify if those exact vehicles were left outside any new tariff relief. When American negotiators tried to draw the line at cars only, Canada pushed back hard, insisting the lower rate needed to extend to trucks as well. According to people briefed on the private negotiations, that specific standoff over vehicle classifications was the detail that ultimately sank the broader agreement late Friday night. The second issue Carney described was even more unusual for a trade negotiation because it had almost nothing to do with tariffs directly. He said the United States, in the final hours of talks, introduced language that would have restricted Canada's ability to pursue trade and security agreements with other countries. In other words, part of what was on the table by Friday night was not simply how much Canada pays to sell steel or vehicles into the American market. It was language that would have constrained who else Canada is allowed to build economic relationships with going forward, a demand that touches directly on the diversification strategy Ottawa has spent well over a year building through new agreements with the European Union, the United Arab Emirates, Ecuador, and several other partners. Carney did not go into extensive detail about this specific wording, but he was unambiguous about how seriously his government treated the request, describing it as an attempt to restrict Canada's broader trade relationships rather than simply resolve the dispute directly in front of them. The third issue landed closest to home in a different way entirely. Carney said American negotiators also sought language touching Canada's protections for its language and culture, and by extension, he said, its sovereignty. He did not elaborate publicly on the precise mechanism, but the timing matters here, because Quebec's premier had already drawn her own red line days earlier, naming the protection of culture and language alongside dairy supply management as two things she considered non-negotiable, regardless of what federal negotiators eventually signed. When a provincial premier draws that kind of line publicly before a deal is even finalized, and then federal officials cite exactly that category of demand as one of the reasons the whole thing collapsed, it tells you the disagreement here extended well past economics into territory that touches how Canadians see their own national identity inside this relationship. Put those three things together, trucks, sovereignty over future trade deals, and language and culture protections, and you start to understand why Carney chose the word attacked on Saturday, rather than something softer. He was not simply describing a tariff rate he considered too high. He was describing a set of demands that, in his framing, reached into how independently Canada gets to run its own economic and cultural affairs going forward. Asked directly about critical minerals during that same press conference, Carney was equally blunt, saying Canada would never give the United States exclusive access to that resource, a pointed remark given how much American industrial and defense strategy increasingly depends on exactly the minerals Canada happens to hold in abundance. With no agreement reached by the Friday midnight deadline, the 50% tariffs that had been paused for 3 days went into effect at the stroke of midnight. $20 billion worth of Canadian goods are now facing that additional duty, covering everything from wine, hockey equipment, and cement to clothing, fishing rods, building materials, liquor, and famously tongue depressors, a detail that has become something of a symbol for just how far-reaching these tariff lists actually run once you get past the headline categories. The administration did carve out several major exemptions, notably energy, potash, and critical minerals, the same categories that stayed protected back when Section 338 was first invoked in July, a detail that tells you plenty about where Washington still perceives its own vulnerability sitting inside this relationship, even in the middle of an active trade war. Carney called the fresh tariffs a miscalculation on Saturday morning and laid out precisely how Canada intends to respond. Starting September 8th, the Tuesday after Labor Day, Canada will apply dollar-for-dollar counter tariffs targeting American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. He said the specific details of those measures would be released in the coming days, but the headline framework is already locked in publicly, a direct, sector-by-sector mirror of the pain the United States has just imposed on Canadian exporters. It is worth pausing on that dollar for dollar language for a moment, because it is not simply a political talking point. Matching tariffs precisely, rather than escalating beyond what was received, is a deliberate signal that Canada is positioning this as proportional self-defense, rather than an open-ended escalation, even while using unmistakably combative language to describe it publicly. If you're watching this and wondering whether Canada's political class is actually unified behind this response, or whether Carney is out on a limb here, the answer became clear within hours of his press conference. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, whose province carries the heaviest exposure to both the auto tariffs and the steel tariffs, had spent the days leading up to the collapse notably silent in public. That silence ended abruptly on Saturday. Ford came out and backed Carney's decision to walk away, calling the deal that had been on the table a terrible deal that failed to alleviate pressure on his province's auto and steel sectors, and revealing that he had actually opposed the proposed framework even as it was being outlined to premiers days earlier. In a letter to the Prime Minister that had been sent privately earlier in the week but was only published publicly the same day the talks collapsed, Ford went further still, pointing to Canada's energy and critical mineral assets as genuine leverage points and suggesting that any retaliatory measures specifically target products from what he called politically significant American states, naming Florida, Texas, Iowa, and Wisconsin directly, and arguing that goods from those states should face the full force of Canada's response. That kind of explicit political targeting, aimed at states carrying outsized weight in upcoming midterm elections, is a notable escalation in tone from a premier who has clashed with Trump before but has generally stopped short of that level of specificity. And Ford was far from alone. Jason Kenney, a former Alberta premier and a political rival of Carney's own party, publicly praised the Prime Minister for walking away from the table rather than accepting what was on offer, describing Canada's effort as a serious, good-faith attempt to secure stability and market access, while making clear the country was not, in his words, cravenly surrendering in the face of constant economic and political aggression. When a politician from an opposing party goes out of his way to publicly credit a rival prime minister for holding firm, that tells you something meaningful about where Canadian public opinion actually sits right now. A poll conducted by Ledger Marketing this week found that 56% of Canadians want their government to take a hard line and make no further concessions to Washington, a number that gives Carney considerably more political room to hold his position than he might have had at any earlier point in this 18-month standoff. On the American side, the tone from Washington has been markedly less conciliatory. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer appeared on Fox News over the weekend and made clear there are currently no plans for further talks with Canada. He characterized the breakdown as a missed opportunity for Canada to partner with the United States and argued that Canada had always had access to what he called the best deal in the world and still would have had an even better one, but chose not to take it. Greer also placed Canada in the same category as China, describing them as the only two economies that have chosen to retaliate against American tariffs rather than absorb them, a framing that positions Ottawa alongside Washington's most significant trade adversary rather than treating it as the historic ally it has been for the better part of a century. Perhaps most significantly, Greer confirmed the United States intends to move forward with what he called measures that respond to Canadian retaliation, language that strongly suggests Washington is already preparing some form of further escalation once Canada's September 8th tariffs actually take effect, rather than treating this as a stable, if painful, new equilibrium. Trump's own reaction, posted to social media early Sunday morning, leaned into a familiar framing rather than offering any conciliatory note. He wrote that Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one, and claimed that Canada had for years charged American farmers massive amounts in tariffs, adding simply, no more. That specific line about statehood is not new rhetoric from Trump when it comes to Canada, but deploying it in the same breath as announcing a formal trade war escalation adds a layer of political charge to what is already, on pure economic terms, an extraordinarily consequential rupture between two of the world's most deeply integrated economies. Consider, too, what this specific breakdown reveals about the internal dynamics inside the American negotiating team itself, because Carney was notably pointed about this during his Saturday remarks. When reporters asked whether U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's involvement had affected how the talks unfolded, Carney responded by contrasting the two delegations directly, saying Canada's team, including its ambassador in Washington, remained fully unified throughout the process, and adding pointedly that the same could not be said about the American side. He also referenced a string of what he described as insulting statements from senior American officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance, Trade Representative Greer, and Secretary Lutnick, arguing those comments made clear that key figures inside the administration held little genuine regard or respect for Canada as a negotiating partner. That kind of direct, on-the-record criticism of named senior officials from a sitting prime minister, rather than the usual diplomatic vagueness reserved for moments like this, is itself a meaningful departure from how Carney has typically discussed the American administration throughout the earlier phases of this dispute, and it reinforces just how far this particular breakdown pushed the relationship compared to every previous flashpoint in this 18-month fight. Zoom out for a moment and look at the scale of what is actually at stake here, because the numbers explain why both governments spent an entire week trying so hard to avoid exactly this outcome before ultimately failing to do so. Canada still sends close to 72% of everything it exports to the United States, a dependency level that has barely moved despite more than a year of high-profile diversification efforts toward Europe, the Gulf, and Asia. The two countries did roughly $900 billion in total trade last year, making this one of the largest and most deeply interconnected bilateral economic relationships anywhere on the planet. 36 American states count Canada as their single largest export destination, which means the political fallout from this breakdown will not stay contained to Ottawa and Washington. It will land directly on governors, senators, and manufacturers across a huge swath of the American heartland, many of them in exactly the kind of politically significant states Doug Ford named in his letter. The Trump administration is walking into this escalation just months ahead of November's midterm elections, at a moment when American voters are already frustrated with the overall cost of living. And tariffs that are ultimately paid by American importers tend to show up in consumer prices fairly quickly once they take hold. There's also a structural dimension sitting quietly underneath this entire fight that extends well beyond whatever happens on September 8th. This breakdown complicates, in a very direct way, the future of the broader continental trade agreement that has governed North American commerce for years. Earlier this summer, the United States had already declined to extend that agreement in its current form at its scheduled review, triggering a legal mechanism that forces the three countries into a full decade of mandatory annual reviews, rather than a clean, settled framework. A collapse this serious, arriving in the middle of that already fragile review process, does not simply add friction to next year's checkup. It raises the very real possibility that the entire agreement enters its next scheduled review, carrying open wounds from an active, unresolved trade war, rather than a stable baseline both sides can build from. Analysts who track this relationship closely have already begun describing the situation using words that were essentially unthinkable a decade ago for two countries that share the world's longest undefended border, calling this an unprecedented breakdown in relations between longtime allies rather than simply the latest chapter in an ongoing negotiation. Look also at what this means for the wider category of goods and industries not yet directly named in either round of tariffs, because the exemptions still standing on both sides tell an important story of their own. Energy, potash, and critical minerals remain untouched by Washington's tariffs, just as they were when Section 338 was first invoked back in July, and Canada's own retaliation list, steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, notably avoids touching those same protected categories from the other direction as well. Both governments appear to be deliberately keeping the most structurally significant parts of this relationship: the oil that feeds American refineries, the potash that feeds American farms, the minerals that feed American defense and technology manufacturing, outside the boundaries of open conflict, even while everything else gets pulled into an increasingly bitter fight. That restraint, whether intentional signaling or simple mutual recognition of how much damage touching those sectors would cause to both economies simultaneously, may end up being the most important detail in this entire story, because it suggests neither side has actually decided to treat this as an unlimited economic confrontation, regardless of how combative the public language from both capitals has become. It is worth remembering how we actually got here, because the escalation did not happen in one sudden leap. This entire fight traces back to February of last year, when the first wave of tariffs hit Canadian goods at 25%, prompting retaliatory tariffs from Canada that expanded within weeks to well over 100 billion Canadian dollars in targeted American products. Provinces pulled American liquor off government store shelves almost in unison shortly afterward, a coordinated response that Washington later cited as part of its justification for the broader tariff escalation that followed. Then came July's invocation of Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law that had not been used to impose actual tariffs in 96 years, reactivated specifically because a Supreme Court ruling earlier in the year had stripped away Trump's broader emergency tariff powers. Each escalation added new sectors, new percentages, and new deadlines, and each deadline, until this one, had ultimately produced some form of extension or partial agreement rather than an outright breakdown. This is the first time in the entire 18-month sequence that a deadline has actually resulted in tariffs landing and staying in place, alongside a formally announced retaliation date rather than another round of extended talks. There is also a domestic political petition worth mentioning briefly, because it captures just how far public sentiment in Canada has shifted over the course of this fight. A petition calling for the expulsion of the current American ambassador, a Trump ally and former Republican congressman, has collected close to 250,000 signatures since it launched in late July, driven largely by frustration over comments seen as normalizing talk of annexing Canada outright. That petition will almost certainly not result in an actual expulsion, and the government has given no indication it intends to pursue anything of the sort. But its scale is a useful barometer of how much public patience in Canada has eroded over the course of this specific negotiation, patience that Carney is now clearly counting on as he holds his position through the retaliation period, rather than returning to the table on terms he has already publicly rejected. That distinction matters enormously for how markets and industry groups are treating this moment. Every previous deadline in this saga carried an implicit assumption that both sides ultimately wanted to avoid the cliff badly enough to find some last-minute off-ramp. And for a year and a half, that assumption consistently held. This weekend, for the first time, it did not. Whether that represents a permanent shift in how this relationship functions going forward, or simply a particularly bad week that eventually gets patched over once both sides feel the economic pain of tariffs actually landing, is the single most important question hanging over the next 2 weeks. Ryan Majerus, a trade partner at a major Washington law firm who has been tracking these negotiations closely, offered a fairly simple explanation for why this particular round finally broke down where previous ones did not, suggesting Canada likely wanted deeper sector-specific relief than the United States was ultimately willing to offer, or that whatever concessions Canada put on the table simply did not go far enough to satisfy Washington's negotiators heading into the final hours. Consider also what both governments are now signaling about what comes after September 8th, because neither side is describing this as a one-time event. Greer's comment about the United States moving forward with measures that respond to Canadian retaliation strongly implies Washington already has a next step prepared, ready to deploy the moment Canada's counter-tariffs actually take effect. Carney, for his part, has been equally direct about the fact that Canada does not intend to back down simply because retaliation carries real costs at home. He acknowledged plainly that Canada's countermeasures will raise costs and reduce choice for Canadian consumers. A rare moment of a sitting Prime Minister openly admitting his own policy will make life somewhat more expensive for the people who elected him, rather than pretending retaliation is somehow painless. That kind of candor is unusual in political messaging around trade disputes, and it suggests Carney is betting that Canadian public opinion, currently sitting at 56% in favor of holding a hard line, will continue to support the economic cost of standing firm rather than turning against the government once grocery and hardware prices start reflecting the new tariffs. It is also worth walking through exactly what Carney offered Washington before things fell apart, because it undercuts any suggestion that Canada simply refused to negotiate in good faith. According to Carney's own account, Canada had been willing to drop its remaining retaliatory tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos entirely, provided the United States substantially lowered its own duties in those same sectors. Canada was also prepared to encourage provinces to lift the alcohol bans that have kept American liquor off Canadian shelves for more than a year, a politically sensitive ask, given that liquor distribution sits under provincial rather than federal control, meaning Carney would have needed genuine cooperation from premiers like Ford to actually deliver on that promise. In Carney's telling, Canada showed up prepared to make real, substantive concessions across multiple sectors simultaneously, only to watch the American side introduce entirely new demands on trucks, on future trade deals, and on cultural protections in the final hours rather than simply closing the gap on the terms already under discussion. That sequence, concessions offered early followed by expanded demands late, is precisely why Carney framed the breakdown the way he did on Saturday, describing it not as a failure to find middle ground, but as Washington asking too much while offering too little in return. There's a broader pattern worth naming here as well, because Canada's response this weekend puts it in genuinely rare company among America's traditional allies. Several major economies facing similarly aggressive tariff pressure over the past year and a half chose a different path entirely, preparing retaliatory measures, but repeatedly suspending them while negotiations continued, rather than actually letting them take effect. Canada, by contrast, has now become one of only two economies globally, alongside China, willing to let a real trade war actually play out with the United States, rather than continuing to negotiate indefinitely under threat. Academics who study Canadian politics closely have described this moment as the clearest test yet of an argument Carney has made publicly and repeatedly since well before this specific standoff began, that so-called middle powers need to demonstrate genuine willingness to absorb short-term economic pain rather than simply yielding every time a larger economy applies pressure or risk finding themselves permanently at the mercy of whichever government happens to be sitting in Washington at any given moment. Whether that bet pays off now depends heavily on what happens over the next 2 weeks before Canada's own tariffs actually take effect, and on how the American side chooses to respond once they do. If Washington genuinely moves forward with additional measures as Greer suggested, expect this relationship to keep deteriorating through September, rather than stabilizing, potentially dragging in sectors that have so far stayed protected, like energy or critical minerals, categories both sides have carefully avoided touching throughout this entire fight, precisely because doing so would represent a genuinely different order of economic confrontation. If, instead, the shock of tariffs actually landing on both sides brings negotiators back to the table before September 8th arrives, this weekend may eventually be remembered as the moment the relationship hit its lowest point before finally forcing a real resolution, rather than the opening chapter of something considerably longer and more damaging. Trade lawyers who have watched every twist of this 18-month fight tend to agree on one point regardless of which outcome they consider more likely: that the credibility cost of this particular breakdown, a publicly announced deal that collapsed within days of being celebrated by both leaders, is going to make the next round of talks, whenever it eventually happens, considerably harder to conduct with any real trust remaining on either side of the negotiating table. There's also a simple asymmetry in how each side experiences the coming weeks that is worth spelling out plainly. American importers, not Canadian exporters, are the ones actually writing the checks for the 50% tariffs now in effect. A technical detail about how tariffs function that tends to get lost in the political framing, but matters enormously for where the economic pressure actually lands first. Those costs typically get passed along to American businesses and consumers well before Ottawa feels equivalent pain from its own retaliatory measures, since Canada's countermeasures do not take effect until September 8th, more than 2 weeks after Washington's tariffs already began landing on Canadian goods. That gap gives Washington a head start in terms of collected tariff revenue, but it also means American businesses reliant on Canadian steel, dairy inputs, and building materials will feel the cost increase considerably sooner than Canadian businesses feel the mirrored pressure heading in the other direction. A timing imbalance that could shape how quickly political pressure builds inside each country to actually return to the table. Markets are watching this unfold with noticeably more caution than they showed during any of the earlier deadlines in this saga, precisely because this is the first one that actually broke down rather than producing another extension. Steel, dairy, agricultural equipment, and electronics companies on both sides of the border are now bracing for real, immediate cost increases starting the second week of September, not a hypothetical scenario they might need to plan around eventually. Currency and commodity desks are treating this as a genuine structural escalation, rather than simply another round of negotiating theater. And the language both governments are now using publicly, war, attacked, miscalculation, no further talks planned, is considerably sharper than anything either side deployed during the earlier phases of this fight. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what collapsed this weekend and why, hit subscribe so you do not miss how this plays out before September 8th arrives. Share it with someone who still thinks this is just another routine tariff dispute between friendly neighbors. And drop a comment below telling me whether you think Canada's retaliation actually holds through Labor Day, or whether renewed talks pull both sides back from the brink before the new tariffs ever take effect. Either way, watch what happens in the next 2 weeks closely, because for the first time in this entire 18-month standoff, both governments are now openly using the language of confrontation rather than negotiation. And that shift in tone alone tells you this relationship has entered territory it has not occupied in generations. Whatever comes next, September 8th is no longer a hypothetical date sitting somewhere on a calendar. It is now the next confirmed milestone in a trade war that both governments, for the first time in a year and a half, are choosing to fight rather than delay, and the entire continent will be watching to see what actually happens when that date finally arrives.